Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Truckers Podcast, FYI, Conversations Without Barriers. I'm your host, Doug from Ontario, Canada. It is 8:30 a.m. here on the 14th of December. I hope everybody's had a good week. It is now officially the weekend. I guess we can just give ourselves a pat on the back that we made it here. Yeah, what a week. Trying to post up a show for the weekend, so you get the notification about the show, because I told you to just be doing my shows on Saturday mornings and Sunday mornings, because it's just become too difficult to get a show in during the evenings during the week. Yeah, it's been considerably cold right here across Ontario, and that's going to change a little bit as the temperature is going to rise. Excuse me, the seasonal temperatures. Wow, yeah, it's frigid cold out there today. Anyways, balancing enforcement and support new legislation on tent encampments and illicit drugs. The 12 mayors or something like that across Ontario were calling on the Ontario government to invoke the notwithstanding clause to clear tent encampments. And they were probably, looking to have it to come in immediately. And it's ridiculous. The provincial government would be tabling, this legislation, and it's not going to come into effect immediately. The government now is on the winter break hiatus until February. And so here we are. Nothing has changed. And we still have tent encampments. Now, what this piece of legislation is going to do, so balancing the enforcement and support for this new legislation on tent encampments and the illicit drugs, the current state of homelessness and addiction in Ontario is quite concerning. Ontario is experiencing a significant rise in homelessness, with over 1,400 homeless encampments across the province. Shelters are overwhelmed, with around 12,000 people living in Toronto shelters alone. The province is also grappling with a severe addiction crisis. There's a high rate of drug poisonings, with an average of 7 people dying per day due to drug-related issues. The toxic drug supply is serious, and many individuals experiencing homelessness also struggle with mental health issues. And approximately 75% of Ontario's homeless population have or have had a mental health or substance use disorder. There is a significant demand for supportive housing, which provides a stable foundation for recovery and community integration. Now, in the early 90s, our national housing program was eliminated. If we had rallied to save the housing program, Canada would not be suffering from the homeless crisis today. And from the end of the Second World War until 1993, the National Housing Program built 650,000 units that continue to house 2 million Canadians. Since the program was canceled, waitlists for affordable housing have become backlogged, and wait times are up to 10 years in most of the big cities. And despite that the evidence that housing is necessary for health and basic survival, the federal governments withdrew from social housing. The provinces followed, downloading responsibility for housing to the cities, which have been largely unable to cope with the demand for affordable housing. And this dismantling of our national program has been a key factor in the growing gap between rich and poor and an explosion of homelessness in our communities. That goes without saying. So there is a significant demand for supportive housing, which provides stable foundation for recovery and community reintegration. Wait times for support of housing are long, with Ontario spending 91,754 days waiting for such housing. The Ontario government has announced plans to introduce legislation aimed at dismantling homeless encampments and cracking down on public drug use and intersecting crises of homelessness, addiction, and mental health have put a strain on communities and the resources. The Ontario government plans to introduce new legislation aimed at addressing homelessness, encampments, and public drug use. The proposed legislation includes several key components, stiffer penalties. The bill will introduce tougher penalties for trespassing and public drug use, with fines up to $10,000 or 6 months in jail. Municipalities and police will receive new resource and enforcement tools to dismantle homeless encampments. The legislation will consider rehabilitation as an alternative to incarceration for minor or nonviolent drug offenses. Premier Doug Ford has stated that the goal is to ensure public safety while providing support for those facing homelessness and addiction. So how does penalizing the homeless with fines up to $10,000 or incarceration for open drug use in public, how does that solve the problem? He says he wants to, provide support for those facing homeless and addiction. However, critics argue that punitive measures alone would not address the root causes of these issues. The mayors who asked Doug Ford to invoke the notwithstanding clause to clear tent encampments, this is their opportunity to create more shelter space. Good morning, and how you doing today? I'm your host, Doug from Ontario, Canada. Hope you had a good week. So as I mentioned before, here in Ontario, that there were several mayors wanting the Premier of Ontario to invoke the notwithstanding clause. That's in the Charter Rights and Freedoms. And the particular part of the Charter, what the government would target with invoking the notwithstanding clause, is the right to life, liberty, and security of a person. See, the notwithstanding clause in Section 33 of the Charter Rights and Freedoms was not meant to be there to be just used at the government's disposal because they're unhappy about something. The abuse of power. And here's a clear example of that. The Premier of Quebec wants to use the notwithstanding clause to stop prayer in public places. That's ridiculous. And the Premier of Quebec, he uses the notwithstanding clause like handing out candy at Halloween. It's absolutely ridiculous. The notwithstanding clause in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is only to be used in emergencies, not when the premiers just feel like it. See, even Premier Doug Ford used the notwithstanding clause to order teachers back to work. That's not what it's there for. To use it, these mayors were calling on the Premier Doug Ford here in Ontario to use the notwithstanding clause to remove tent encampments. Penalizing the homeless is not the answer. Fining the homeless or people with addiction of up to $10,000 or incarceration for repeat offenders is not the answer. So the mayors who asked Doug Ford to invoke the notwithstanding clause to clear tent encampments, this is their opportunity to create more shelter space with a comprehensive winter response plan. The Conservatives are not going to get their agenda passed before the break because they're now on break until February. Even here in the city of London, Ontario, where I reside, City Council failed to put a comprehensive winter response plan together in order to get people out of these encampments and into safe shelter. Homeless shelters are at capacity. The Arcade Mission Services are struggling to keep 30 beds open. And they're trying to raise funds in order to do that because the city had made it very clear that any federal monies coming to help deal with tent encampments are not going to go to the Business Improvement Association areas like the downtown core. Where these two shelters operate. The other one is the Unity Project. So if these mayors were expecting the premier to invoke the notwithstanding clause effective immediately, well, that's not going to happen. And it's not going to get passed before the Christmas break. Communities across Ontario where these tent encampments are, they need to be so all the communities across Ontario where these encampments are, they need to be part of the solution by addressing city councillors to provide immediate shelter. NIMBYism, not in my backyard, needs to be put on the back burner. And by engaging residents and city councilors, we can build a broader support for shelter spaces and services that address homelessness and addiction. See, part of the legislation that the government wants to pass is fine or incarcerate people who openly use illicit drugs in public spaces. The Ford government is already going to be shutting down safe consumption sites, 10 of them right across the province. So the support for the shelter spaces and services that address homelessness and addiction, and the need for the support of housing, social housing, and affordable housing for all to help end this crisis has never been greater and prevent it from happening again. The urgent need for supportive social and affordable housing cannot be overstated. Addressing the housing crisis is fundamental to tackling the interconnected issue of homelessness, and addiction supports are also needed. And the housing integrated services provides individuals stable housing, access to essential services such as mental health support, addiction treatment, and employment assistance. Stability and recovery helps residents achieve stability and work towards recovery, reducing the likelihood of returning to homelessness. And the social housing government nonprofit owned affordable housing managed by government agencies or nonprofits that would offer below market rent to low-income individual families. Long-term solutions provides long-term housing solutions that can break the cycle of poverty and homelessness. Affordable housing accessible to low-income households assure that housing costs do not exceed 30% of the household's income, making affordable for low to moderate income families. A variety of housing types, including a mix of housing options such as rental units, co-ops, ownership opportunities to meet diverse needs, and preventing future crises. And the policies and the investments of the government at all levels need to prioritize these policies. So they need to invest. The governments need to invest in the housing to create and maintain affordable units. And the community involvement, engaging communities in planning and supporting these housing initiatives. We can foster a more inclusive and compassionate approach. Education, advocacy, raising the awareness about the benefits of affordable and supportive housing. That we can help overcome NIMBYism, not in my backyard, and garner broader support by focusing on these types of housings and implementing support of measures that we can create a more resilient and inclusive society where everyone has a chance to thrive. Now, in the early 90s, our national housing program was eliminated. If we had rallied to save the housing program, Canada would not be suffering from a homeless crisis today. And from the end of the Second World War until 1993, the National Housing Program built 650,000 units that continued to house 2 million Canadians. Since the program was canceled, wait times for affordable housing have become backlogged, with wait times up to 10 years or more, and in most of the big cities. So social housing. And social housing for people who have disabilities. And for people looking for social housing who has disabilities, those wait times are even longer, more than 10 years. Despite clear evidence that housing is necessary for health and basic survival, the federal government withdrew from social housing and the provinces followed, downloading responsibility for housing to the cities, which have been largely unable to cope with the demand of affordable housing, and they're unable to cope with the homeless crisis today and the encampments. Seven people on a daily basis are dying on our streets from illicit drug use. And the Ontario government, with this new legislation and imposing penalties and potentially incarceration, is absolutely appalling. Housing first model, and I've stated this before, is the only way out of this crisis, is to providing stable housing, supportive housing. So putting the responsibilities for housing to the cities, which has been largely unable to cope with the demand for affordable housing. This dismantling of our national program has been a key factor in the growing gap between the rich and poor and the explosion of homelessness in our communities. Now's the time for City Council to get together and start opening up more shelter spaces, warming centers, in order to get people out of these tent encampments. Not having a plan in place, a winter response plan, is I feel is just irresponsible of the cities. That you can't even take into account and show some compassion and empathy. We had a pilot project a couple years ago, and they had outfitted office trailers for people to stay in the wintertime, right down the street from where I live. That was back in 2022. There's a little grumbling at first of neighbors. They had round the clock support. They had round the clock security, and it went off without a hitch. And it lasted the entire winter until the spring. They tried other locations. The other location they tried was the closed city golf course. Unfortunately, a neighbor burnt down the clubhouse, so it couldn't be used. And then they had to relocate it again. And they haven't used those outfitted office trailers again, which is really concerning because, they spent all this money. And so where are these trailers? I have no idea. NIMBYism, not in my backyard, is a real concern. I understand communities, they don't want encampments in the neighborhoods. They don't want homeless people around. Well, then where do they go? And we have city councilors, saying a hard no to more funding for more shelter space. It's ridiculous. Temperatures this week, you know, since Wednesday and now uh, this morning, you know, we were hovering around, you know, -8 to -10 with a wind chill of -16. And we have these people in these encampments in this being exposed to these conditions, you know, because the incompetency, the inept individuals on city council can't even put a winter plan together. Saying no to more funding for extra shelter spaces. You know, mayors across Ontario calling for the federal government to implement the notwithstanding clause in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, targeting Section 7 of the Charter, the right to life, liberty, and security of a person. I mean, where the hell are their heads at? All I can just tell them is to pull your thumb out of your ass and open up community centers, open up whatever you need to do, and then you can get these people out of these encampments and into a safe space. For government, when it comes to, you know, this new piece of legislation that they you know, are putting together, and these mayors across Ontario, you know, were hoping that the premier would be implementing the notwithstanding clause immediately. This is something you don't take lightly with this Section 33 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's not there to be used at whenever you feel like it. Just because you're not happy about something. You know, like I said earlier, the Premier of Quebec, you know, he wants to use the notwithstanding clause to stop prayer in public places. Now he wants to go after religion. It's ridiculous. It just tells me how incompetent these city officials are. As the only tool that they think that the Ontario government has, or the only tool that we have, is the notwithstanding clause. Oh, we'll just invoke the notwithstanding clause. That would just solve the goddamn problem. You invoke the notwithstanding clause and clear out 10 encampments. Where do they think the people are going to go? You have no winter plan. So where are they going to go? Nowhere. And punitive penalties on illicit drug use in public of fines up to $10,000 or being incarcerated for repeat offenders. How's that solving the addiction problem? It's not. Treatment for those who want it. They also talked about involuntary treatment, meaning that they want to be able to remove you from the streets against your will and put you into treatment facilities. There is no based evidence that even works, and on the contrary, evidence point to that it's more harmful than good. You know, for an example, the residential school system that took place from the mid 1800s all the way up to 1996, involuntary removing children from their indigenous communities and placing them hundreds of miles away from their communities into residential schools. proved to be detrimental. So involuntary treatment does not work. Housing, supportive housing, social housing, which I mentioned earlier on the show, in the early 90s, that our national housing program was eliminated, placing the burden on the cities across Ontario to build social housing. Which has led up to the crisis that we're facing today. And all over Canada. And like I said, the mayors were hoping that this legislation would be passed before the winter break, and that's not going to happen. And they're still going to be grappling with this crisis. And also, too, I mean, the Premier of Ontario has to be very careful how he drafts this piece of legislation, because the courts may have something to say about it. But Doug Ford, the Premier, also said, well, if the courts don't like some certain piece of the legislation, he'll just invoke the notwithstanding clause, and then it becomes unchallengeable in court for 5 years. I mean, if this is how people are going to respond and how they're going to react, to this crisis. And like I said, thinking that this one piece of legislation in the charter is the notwithstanding clause that's the only tool that you have in your toolbox. Now, an example where the notwithstanding clause might have been effective was back in 2022 with the trucker freedom protest in Ottawa that lasted for 3 weeks. Finally, the federal government steps in and invokes the Federal Emergency Act. And then we had the courts rule on that and then say, no, the government should not have done that and could not have invoked it, because they said that Ontario didn't use all the tools in their toolbox to clear that protest. Now, maybe the notwithstanding clause could have been effective. It would have prevented you from protesting. And it would have gave the province the power to clear out all those trucks in the downtown core of Ottawa. Something like that you could use the notwithstanding clause for, but you just can't just simply just use it whenever you feel like it. But it seems that the mayors across Ontario thinking that you can, and premiers across Canada thinking that, I don't know any better way of how to deal with our problems. We'll just implement the notwithstanding clause. That's it seems to be, and especially in Quebec, that seems just to be the solution to their problems. We'll just invoke the notwithstanding clause and override whatever part of the charter that they're addressing. Doug Ford said if necessary, he'll use the notwithstanding clause to clear tent encampments. And the courts have stated you cannot clear tent encampments unless you have suitable shelter. And apparently we don't have suitable shelters, so you just can't clear tent encampments. But leaving people out in the cold isn't the answer neither. You can open up community centers, other warming spaces. We have a lot of empty office spaces in the downtown core. But see, the downtown core is bitching and complaining about the homeless in the downtown core. Nobody wants the encampments. Nobody wants extra added shelter spaces in certain areas. Well, then, I mean, my question to them: if you got a better solution, then by all means, step up and tell us what it is. If you don't want them there, then where? Because I'll bet you this. I bet you this. If I were to go around to communities and say, hey, we're going to open up a warming center here. We're going to open up a shelter space here in your community. What do you say to that? To get people out of tent encampments and into safety. What do you think they're going to say to that? Not in my backyard. No, you're going to have to find another community. Then I'll move on to another community, say, hey, we want to open up temporary shelter spaces here for the duration of the winter and warming spaces. What do you say to that? It'll be no right across the board. I'll guarantee it. But yet, you want the government and yet you want the municipalities and cities to do something about the encampments. But yet, you don't want them in your community. How do you solve that? And we're talking about human beings here, right? We're talking about lives. We're talking about human lives. But yet you don't have any solutions to deal with it. I think the mayors who penned this letter to the premier asking him to invoke the notwithstanding clause. I think they're really disappointed right now because they're not getting that legislation passed. But um, the wording and everything in this legislation, um, when it comes to punishing those who have an addiction with monetary fines or imprisonment, doesn't solve the addiction problem. Using illicit drugs in open spaces is, he's shutting down safe consumption sites. And then he says, I'm going to fine you or put you in jail, for repeat offenses. How does that make any sense? We need treatment centers. Closing safe injection sites is going to prove to be fatal. Making it illegal to use drugs in open spaces, public spaces. They'll just go underground. They'll go hide somewhere, and potentially, OD and not being found in time. The government okayed these safe injection sites and their locations. The ones that they're closing are near schools and daycare centers, which they approved to have them opened in those areas, and now they're closing them. No needle exchange programs. That all will be gone as well. Putting the cart before the horse doesn't work. People who work closely, these social services that work closely with people who have addiction or homeless, they just can't understand, the reasoning behind, this piece of legislation that's just going to penalize people who are homeless, people who have a mental illness, addiction. Not spending enough on social housing, supportive housing. It's the only way out of it. You know, a couple months ago, the Premier of Ontario, he said he wants to spend $80 billion on tunneling under the busiest highway in North America. So a highway under a highway. It's going to solve the congestion problems on the busiest highway in North America. $80 billion. Just imagine what he could do with this $80 billion. Could systematically end homelessness with $80 billion. Spending $75 million is a drop in the bucket, or maybe not, for treatment centers, housing. It still isn't going to be enough. It'll be a start, but it still isn't going to be enough. Community involvement is where we have to probably, get back to doing again town hall meetings. I can say to the community, say, look, you have these tent encampments in your neighborhoods. Well, then you need to go to city council and demand that they're sheltered. You need to create the shelter space, open up shelter space, and you need to do it now. You don't wait till February when the provincial government comes back to Queen's Park, tables this legislation, passes this legislation, and you have no plan. That'd be ridiculous. They need to have a plan now, and if they don't have a plan now, like the City of London, Ontario, where I reside, they need to get a plan. And communities across the city need to stop with NIMBYism, not in my backyard. You don't want the encampments there? Then stand up and say something. Do something. Demand that they be put into other shelters and you open other shelter spaces. Do something for mankind. I'm out here on my podcast talking about this. I talk to my fellow workers about this. I talk to family about this. Send an email off to the mayor about this. Well, I want to thank you for joining me this morning. Man, it's a cold one out there today. It's supposed to, get better as the weekend goes on. Um, we'll see. Forecasts change all the time, but I'm telling you right now, it's bitter cold out there. So until I guess tomorrow morning, ladies and gentlemen, I come back out here and talk about something. We'll figure it out. I'm really diving into this book, Homelessness: How to End the National Crisis, written by Jack Layton. And I think I'll take some points out of there, out of some of the chapters that I've read. Um, we'll talk about a little bit of who Jack Layton, who he was. Um, he's no longer with us. His wife is the mayor of Toronto. It's a good read. I'm really glad I bought this book. I really am. And so kind of reading two books at the same time too. Ending homeless in Canada, written by Jack Hughes. Almost done that book here, but just going through um, the preface of the book of this one here, written by Jack Layton. Um, Homelessness: How to End the National Crisis. Um, yeah, it's another book I just can't put down. So I'll, highlight some of the things that I was reading about tomorrow morning in this book. And that, so enjoy your weekend, ladies and gentlemen, and the upcoming work week tomorrow morning at 8:30. If you can join me, that's great. If you can't, I understand. Until then, take care and be safe. Thanks for coming out here on the Truckers Podcast. I'm your host, Doug from Ontario, Canada. Thank you.